Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's event. My name is Jessy Abouarab. I'm a visiting assistant professor at the Center for Women's and Gender Studies here at Florida International University. On behalf of the Václav Havel Program for Human Rights and Diplomacy and Stephen J. Green School of International Relations and Public Affairs, I want to welcome you to today's event. We are very grateful for the collaboration and co-sponsorship of the Ruth K. Shepard Broad Distinguished Lecture Series, Jean Monnet's European Center for Excellence, European and Eurasian Studies Program, and our very own Center for Women's and Gender Studies. With that, I have the privilege and honor of leading today's conversation with Dr. Markus Thiel about their new book, Europe's International Promotion of LGBTI Rights, Promises, and Pitfalls, that was recently published with Routledge. Dr. Thiel is an associate professor in the Department of Politics and International Relations at Florida International University and the director of the Miami, Florida Jean Monnet Center of Excellence. Their area of expertise range between politics of Western Europe, international organizations, European identity politics, human rights, sexual politics, political sociology of the EU and European Union politics, nationalism, identity politics, and whatnot. So this distinguished author published several EU-related articles, book chapters, books in various academic journals and world-leading book publishing companies and highly reputable venues. Too many to enumerate in such a short time. So relating to today's topic, some of their most notable pieces focused on the limits of transnationalism, the collective identities and EU integration, European civil society and human rights advocacy, issues on how LGBTQ claims shape IR, European identity and culture, narratives, identity politics in the age of globalization. So today we're going to talk about Dr. Thiel's groundbreaking work that examines the often inconsistent, highly visible, and normative diffusion of the European Union strategy in promoting LGBTI rights in those difficult terrains, both internally and externally. So for me, this book promises to transform the very foundation of how we study the EU's institutional attempts to jointly formulate and implement local policies and external policies, guidelines for promoting LGBTQI rights that mostly evoke contestations, pushbacks, and is often labeled, only happening, in certain spaces. So this book critically reflects and analyzes the intersectional EU practice promoting LGBTQI rights. Such complex and contentious issue is studied through several intersecting lenses that cross disciplines, from sociological institutionalist perspective, critical constructivist theories, and using also queer theoretical thought. So I'm not going to go into it much, into it deeply. I just want to say that aside from all of this, Dr. Thiel is an engaged scholar, a dedicated mentor, a passionate philanthropist that I know, not only because of what is there, but I had the privilege of being his student, gaining some of his scholarly wisdom that he shared with all his students, an inspiring mentor who kind of pushed us into community engagement, and his unconditional generosity in philanthropic extracurricular activities. I've saw it first hand through inviting us to the Point Foundation, where they celebrate and empower scholars, alumni in exceeding and achieving their academic careers. So with no further ado, right, I'm gonna pass the mic by asking Dr. Thiel, Markus, to tell us more about this book and give us a brief overview before we start our conversation.
Great. Thank you so much, Jessy. I really appreciate it, Dr. Abouarab. And your really kind words. I'm also glad to see that so many are interested. Before we begin, have a few slides that I'm going to try to get through in 10-15 minutes. So we have time to some, you can ask me question. I'm not going to go through all of the information there. And hopefully there will be questions from the audience, either verbally, I guess, or is it probably through the Q&A box, right? So on the bottom, so folks can ask questions. Thanks also to Ophelia, who helped to prepare today's seminar, and then the Václav Havel program, of course. I want to thank also the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence at FIU and the Women's and Gender Studies program, as well as SIPA, the School of International Public Affairs, for making this possible. So what is about? Let me jump right in. I'm going to have some illustrative slides, like I said. I'm not going to go through the whole detail on every slide, but I think this will help us understand a little bit better what I'm interested in. And I'm sharing right now, so I hope, can you see this? Yep, perfect, thank you, appreciate it. What's the time? 3:06, good. So there on the right, you can see the book cover, right? In all nice rainbow colors, of course, but the title really gives it away. The European Union's international LGBTI promotion policies. Promises and pitfalls, right? So on the one hand, of course, I recognize the eminent role that the European Union plays, as an international LGBT rights promoter. But at the same time, there are also unintended consequences of what you said earlier already, is sort of a slightly overly visible, highly liberal promotion of actors that are really often unequal in nature, right? Just think of the global north, global south differentiation. So, and here on the left-hand side, you see a picture from the European Commission building in Brussels, right? Which kind of neatly combines sort of the EU flag, of course, with a big projection of the rainbow flag, right? That's seen everywhere. By the way, LGBTI refers to the, I've used that title because that's the official term that the European Union uses, right? So irrespective of all, the alphabet soup that is connected to that. To begin with, I want to show you here a quick little map from the ILGA, the International Gay and Lesbian Transgender Intersex Association. And this map shows you the sexual orientation laws in the world. So it gives you sort of a legal positioning where each country is. And just for all of us, in case we're not quite yet, we will have quite yet the knowledge, I want you to take a look at it and sort of get a feeling, right, for the differences in the legal standing in each country. And basically, the darker blue ones are the ones that have quite strong constitutional protections enshrined in their national laws. You can see here Mexico, Bolivia, right, Ecuador, Sweden, and Portugal, amongst others. And then, as it gets lighter blue, you have sort of less strongly legal principles and norms enshrined. And then when it, of course, goes into the orange and into the darker brown ones, you find that there are, they're least regulated, they're the least number of legal provisions and protections. And in fact, there is some legal discrimination going on, right? Like the prohibition of same-sex relationships, even the prohibition of homosexuality per se, or the prohibition of homosexual acts, however they are defined. And so here you can see already that, yeah, unfortunately, sort of, Europe is doing okay, but it's also diverse. You can see different shades of blue. And then you see Africa and the Middle East, which kind of stand out, right, globally. I'll show you another map that gives you later on a little bit more of an indicator of sort of also the social attitudes, because those are, of course, also important in how countries respond to the EU's international LGBT rights promotion. Now, very quickly, I want to show you the table of contents. And here you can see, aside from the introduction where I ask, is there some sort of queer war internationally going on, as Altman and others have called it, or is it a clash of civilizations, right? A sexual clash of civilizations, which I try to dissect that binary. Later on, I'll have a theoretical chapter on norm diffusion and say, like, it's really not so much about norm diffusion, but really what we're talking about is norm polarization and norm contestation. And then the third chapter talks about it's more EU-centric for the EU policy nerds such as me, looking at sort of the diversity and disparity amongst member states, but also how fragmented the EU as a superordinate organization is. And then I basically have 3 case country chapters. Number 4 compares EU enlargement for candidate states that want to join the EU and the conditions that are attached there, and the EU neighborhood policy. Chapter 5 talks about the political conditionality, the human rights clause that is attached to countries that want to receive EU development aid. And the sixth final substantive chapter talks about the EU's promotion of LGBT rights within the UN's Human Rights Council in particular. Finally, I'm ending up with a conclusion that says, we really need to not focus only so narrowly on LGBT rights per se, but the deterioration of LGBT rights most often occurs in a broader deterioration of democratic qualities, right? And so there needs to be a broader and more intersectional outlook on international LGBTI rights promotion. Very quickly with the introduction, the 27 member states that make up the European Union, as well as the European Union institutions, emphasize human as well as, of course, contained therein LGBT rights internally. That is, for new member states, they need to profess that they're respecting human rights. There's also a fundamental rights agency that kind of conducts survey and research on the state of human rights within the EU. But then also externally, they do so. It started particularly with the 2013 foreign policy guidelines that the foreign policy ministers of the EU developed. There are also annual EU human rights reports that you can see, and I also perused those as part of my research. Rights promotion then is also advanced by powerful EU co-financed NGOs such as ILGA Europe. They have sort of privileged access to the EU institutions when it comes to consultations. Now, whereas then overall the EU in general is fairly conducive to LGBT rights promotion, in external relation, that their actions are rather contested because it challenges, of course, other countries' sovereignty. And so one of the tensions is that whereas the EU, often most countries and the EU institutions in Brussels view LGBTI rights norms as constitutive for their political identity, as a basis for their political identity, other countries in the particular global south view the EU's promotion of those rather as regulatory, right? Permissive, you have to implement yada, yada, yada. As you said, my approach is sort of merges between sociological institutionalism as well as critical constructivism, looking at sort of the social construction of these policies, infused with some valuable queer feminist perspectives, because I think we need to recognize that LGBT rights are based on feminist work, right, historically and sociologically, and queer theory also. That's sort of my sort of queer theory moment where I sort of say like, hey, that liberal rights promotion may actually produce more contestation than positive effects. In terms of empirics, I did some interviews, 12 interviews to substantiate some of my theoretical assumptions, a small survey, and document analysis. Now, the main questions are, is the EU's international LGBT rights promotion conducive, or does it produce counterproductive effects internationally? Does the cooperation with other international organizations in the UN or through the neighborhood policy make a meaningful difference? And are there, finally, in the conclusion, are there alternatives to the often conditional imposition of LGBT rights norms to avoid the contentious reliance on those? The second and third chapter very quickly problematizes the influential notion that the EU is supposed to be, and Europe, a normative actor. That means somebody who acts based on norms, values, and ethics. That is overly idealistic. That's a highly contested concept in EU literature, but that's also highly cited. It's a very popular literature. And so I very clearly come out on the critical side and say like that sort of distinction whereby the EU is sort of the good cop and showing the rest of the world, sort of what to do, that creates and maintains geopolitical and socioeconomic inequalities, particularly given that the EU is such a powerful economic neoliberal actor. It also details the chapter, the Eurocentric genealogy, the origin of human rights, right, in a sort of very Western Eurocentric way, and the emergence of LGBTI rights fairly late, as well as human rights, as geopolitical in the UN, going back to the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and how so there was a East-West split between the superpowers, right, with following repercussions. I can go more into detail if there's some interest in the Q&A. And I critically position the EU's rights promotion between Massad's Gay International, right, who said, you know, the West is sort of like having this gay international mafia that then sort of pressures the global South societies, and the EU's self-idealized NPE normative power Europe, coming out to say, just with Chakrabarti, that rather than to universalize the EU's LGBT rights promotion, we actually need to kind of provincialize, see the EU's promotion as regionally contingent and specific. Chapter 3 really looks at the EU itself and highlights the disparity that among member states exists, as well as the fragmentation of EU institutions. And to show you some of that disparity, I'll put up here the rainbow map, Europe's rainbow map from ILGA Europe. And you got to take this with caution, because it also, of course, leads to a certain type of stereotyping, right? So you cannot just simply say like, okay, in that case, Belgium with 70% out of 100 is doing great in all respects, and you know, Poland with 16% isn't. But it is a general, you know, there's a number of criteria, everything from asylum recognition to family policies to non-discrimination provisions that make up those indicators. And so you can see here, Europe as a whole, and with the black paint, I showed here the EU member states, right? That's the borderline between EU and non-EU member states. And the lighter line shows the Balkans, the candidate states, and Turkey, of course. But you can see here, there is a east-west disparity, right? Distinction going on. What sometimes called the fracture line, you know, the rainbow curtain, and so on and so on. And then to a certain extent, also a northwest one. So one of the arguments I'm making in those chapters is, if the EU itself is incoherent in sort of how they view LGBT rights, and the fact that some countries, Italy just now, right, they last week or this week, they rejected non-discrimination, basic non-discrimination laws based on sexual orientation and gender identity, right? Whereas, you know, other countries have a lot of same-sex provisions already. So if there's this inconsistency, that inconsistency will also, of course, make the EU look like an incoherent actor internationally. In chapter 4, I look at homophobia and what I call EU Europhobia. On the one, it contrasts two central policies, enlargement and neighborhood. And on the bottom here, you see the map, just in case you're not familiar. The enlargement candidates are the light blue ones here, in the case Turkey and most of the Balkan countries. And the orange ones are the neighborhood, the EU's neighborhood countries, the North African countries, and then, you know, the Eastern Partnership countries ranging from Belarus to basically the Caucasus nations. In enlargement policies, there's a conditional incentive. Again, if countries want to become a member in the future, they need to reform. And as such, there's one reform, the chapter that's called fundamental rights, right, amongst many others. However, tracing some of these conditions and the implementation of the policies, a lot of these policies were on the surface. So parliaments maybe were asked to implement, to approve non-discrimination legislation without ever trickling down to policy implementation, to practice, or without having some sort of societal connection and organic, you know, internalization of countries. So I call these Potemkin reforms, just like the fake Russian villages, right? These are reforms that can be easily reversed, and we've seen what happened with a couple newer member states. As soon as they became EU member states, they said, okay, you know what, we're now having a popular referendum because they're supposedly more legitimate, and we reverse some of these LGBT rights that we initially said yes to in order to become EU members. Together with homophobia, societal state homophobia, natalism, meaning sort of a lot of these countries are in demographic decline. So birth rates are important, and LGBTQI plus individuals supposedly do not contribute, right, to sort of the natural birth order. Sovereigntist nationalism and the EU's liberal attitude towards taking in refugees. All of this results in a Europhobia, right? Resistance to the EU in many countries within, but also outside of the EU. In the neighborhood policies, the orange countries and outside of the borders, there are no real incentives for membership. So even though there's a human rights clause to receive EU funds in there, reforms in terms of LGBT rights or even democratic rights are very slow or completely lacking, right? And so there's an inconsistent application in the sense that rewards are given even though the implementation of the incentives and the criteria is not fulfilled in a way. I'm not gonna go to, yeah, here you can see another global record, and that shows you a little bit what I did similarly in writing in the book, where you can see over time the legal as well as the attitudinal changes. And if you just look again at the neighborhood countries surrounding Europe, surrounding the European Union, very little has been achieved despite the EU's money and money and policies. Now I need about 5 more minutes, if that's okay, but I'm trying to get through it. Let me just move on to the next slide, if I can. Okay, I'm not going to go over this one. Chapter 5 talks about development policy. EU is also the biggest development provider in the world collectively. The 27 member states channel their development money largely through Brussels to the EU institutions. So that's important to analyze, mostly to their 79 former colonies, the African, Caribbean, and Pacific ACP states. But there are also sectoral preferences. So for example, France likes to give the money more to their former colonies, right? Belgium to theirs, yada, yada, yada. In all of these aid agreements, there is the human rights clause or human rights political conditionality included. There's a treaty clause in political dialogues, and these lead to conflicts as a result of those rights norms itself, conditioning the receiving of aid on the implementation of EU-style human rights, but also exactly based on just having the pressure of conditionality. And that's called Homo colonialism, right? Sort of a new neo-Homo colonialism, or Ebola from Brussels. So in that sense, EU's human LGBT rights is also viewed as hypocritical in the face of the EU's own protectionist trade policies, its security policies, right? Its refugee policies, keeping up, refugees at the border, where African nations ask European Union leaders, how dare you tell us what we should do in terms of human rights when you are violating our citizens' human rights at your borders. 3 case studies in the chapter compare the different reactions: Uganda, Jamaica, and Indonesia. I don't have time to go into that. I'll happily talk about it later, but I wanted to provide a little bit of a global picture of the EU's impact in very different global regions. So coming out to say that you should rethink conditional linking of LGBT rights promotion to trade and aid agreements, and more carefully calibrate, individualize their country-wise, individualize their external support for activists. The last chapter talks about remember, EU's promotion of LGBT rights in the UN. Here, the UN is a broad but also volatile forum. The UN General Assembly, there's this third committee, or the core is the UN Human Rights Council. That's 45 member states out of the close to 200. There has been some progress, as I say here on top, right? Initially in 2003, the Brazilian resolution was introduced, but it failed because only global North states supported it. So there was a learning effect that the Europeans said, okay, we have to approach others, which they tried. And there was, over time, you see an increase of more supportive countries. But again, it's in that sense, it used to be then the Europeans together with the Latin Americans, right? Again, countries that were democratizing relatively late, and so they have also a more liberal approach. However, the EU and Latin America together, they're constituting only about 15% of all UN member states. They propose these rights as universal, and of course, they receive a lot of resistance from the Islamic organization, the Asian group, and the African group, because in the UN, group politics are very important. So that chapter assesses the EU's strategic use of the Human Rights Council. And I'm saying that there are normative issues with the EU's universal approach, right, in very dissimilar regions. There are political issues. The fact that the EU, as one of the few, has an enhanced observer status in the UN. And that is already critically viewed because that's another Eurocentric, extra that the EU get opposed to the African Union, for example. And there are organizational issues. The fact that the UN is very member state centric. At the same time, the EU's diplomatic service, the External Action Service, tries to negotiate not on behalf, but together with the member states. The EU's access is reliable, but fragmented, slow, and volatile. And so this policy of optics to gain more rights provision comes with increased norm polarization and a politicization of LGBT rights internationally. Finally, The last chapter asks, so what can be done? Well, my main argument here is the main way takeaway. We cannot just see LGBT rights disconnected from women's rights, from refugee rights, and from other rights. There needs to be an intersectional approach, right? And the EU needs to be also more institutions, more reflective to see like what are the unintended consequences of their strong, forceful promotion in dissimilar regions. Civil society is very important, but it cannot be the only promoter, right? There needs to be sort of an interlocking of a number of domestic as well as international organizations. So what is to be done? The EU needs to strengthen its internal LGBT rights regime, as you've seen that is still very inconsistent. It also needs to strengthen, importantly, its refugee rights regime to become more authentic and less hypocritical. And it needs to equally address other severe rights issues internationally. External trade aid associational policies need to become more country targeted with less conditional pressure and more positive incentives for emulation. And there needs to be an intersectional policy on rights defenders that includes other democracy sustaining stakeholders in other countries, such as women's rights organizations, educational institutions, the media, courts, and so on and so on. So on the bottom, I list there are a number, the EU loves to come out with a number of programs, declarations, plans on a regular basis. These are only just some of them. The EU Action Plan on Democracy and Human Rights, the EU Gender Action Plan, the EU Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights. But the question is like, to what extent will they be effective, right? And achieve a more broader improvement of human rights and less of sort of one that politicizes, that has little results and politicizes LGBTI individuals. And with that, I leave it, and thank you for your attention.
That's great. That's such a great summary. But again, like, the book has so much more to unpack. But as you stated, there's this push that see a different type of result, the connection between the theory and the idea of forwarding and furthering LGBTI rights, how in practice gets hijacked by political ambitions, different attitudes and interests that play a game, like you stated, geopolitical, that not only outside of EU's borders, but also inside. Right? Mm-hmm. And how those policies basically become shortcuts when a member to become a state to become a member, they need to push for these laws, but as soon as they are in, there's no follow-up mechanisms for them to make sure that these rights are still there. So again, on the one hand, you have the EU as this trailblazer global actor that is pushing forward these powerful ideas, but then again, the way it is applied on the ground, this translation of it, the behavior makes all these push and pull factors within. So on that, basically, I want to know, like, what inspired you for this book, honestly, and how did this project come about? If you can tell me about it, because it's
sure, yes. Thank you. I'm an EU scholar, right? So EU studies, EU institutions are quite interesting, but as a political sociologist, I'm interested less how the institution interact with the national governments, sort of like the political science side of it, but really how societies, how individuals interact with the fact that Europe is becoming one more and more, let's say, right, through European integration. And my first book was on, remember, the European identity, how does identity become expanded through the process of European integration? And so I've always been interested in identity politics question one way or another. And so finally, I got to the point where I said, okay, I have to merge my interest in LGBT politics with my interest in EU politics. And there was no real, like you said, there was no real study done on the EU's international LGBT rights promotion. Right? There have been books written by Phil Ayoub, a great book about the EU's internal rights promotion within the EU. Koen Slootmakers and others have written a good book about EU accession per se, but sort of the international promotion, there was nothing really out there. So I figured this is a great way to look critically, right? Not with the usual liberal, self-congratulatory, highly normative point of view, but really queer critically at the EU's action.
Yeah, exactly. And again, I love how you borrowed different theories from different disciplines to enrich your research. Like when you bring in the history, the colonial history of EU, and how is that played within its neighborhood policies, within the different cases that you look into, and how the push to forward through conditionality and economic and social aid and development aid, which is EU now known for, right? One of the biggest, donors and whatnot in aiding those the South, the global South, right? And how those rhetorics are hijacked internally, either by right-wing nationalists saying like that's too much, we don't want it, and we see like inner cities kind of reacting, pushing back, and creating free zones, like you stated, LGBTI free zones without them and whatnot. And all outside, how political leaders or dictators or whatnot kind of use the same rhetoric from a cultural relativist, saying that these are colonial push, the white savior coming to kind of tell us how we need to live and whatnot, and gaining momentum for their own people. So I really appreciate you showing the diversity, the complexity of different attitudes towards that. And as well, what kind of interested me a lot is this concept of homo nationalism that you talked about, right? How they connected to different attitudes like Europhobia. Right. I recall not a long time ago there was this lesbian activist and I think a political leader that came and used LGBTI, LGBTI rights as a way of saying we don't want those migrants, right? Because those migrants are going to change the way of our lives and all that stuff. And that's why we need stricter border control. We need to limit people that come from certain religious groups and whatnot in order to push their agenda and get elected. So the stigma goes both ways, this othering that you talked about. So on that note, I wanted for you to elaborate a bit more about how basically, since you critically examine the various foreign policies areas within, such as Poland, Hungary, and outside, such as Indonesia and other spaces, in which like the EU promotes the LGBT right from a development aid and the concept of conditionality. What recommendations basically would you make basically to improve their promotion policies and make it more streamlined?
Okay. Thank you. Aside from the sort of the general argument that there needs to be a broader view, right, on LGBT rights embedded in democratic regressions that are unfortunately taking place, and a more intersectional view that takes into account other types of human rights defenders, and there are plenty of those. I would say, given just sort of on the specific policies that the EU has, like you said, there needs to be more. Once a member state becomes a member and fulfills officially these options, they regress back to these popular referendum that then resolve some of it. So there needs to be more follow-up from the European Union, and we've seen slowly sort of a move that they're at least looking at the rule of law. There's a new instrument called the rule of law for all member states to be checked regularly, annually, and that is very contentious for the European nations because that's rule of law is a very sovereigntist ideal, and so I think more of this needs to be happening. It cannot be that once you're an EU member state, you're basically free to do whatever you are, right? In terms of the development policy, again, get rid of human rights conditionality. It has not worked for the past 50 years. It won't work. Also, when I was talking to EU officials, I saw that they were often, the EU, given that it's a regional bloc, they like to make policies often with other regions as a regional package, right? And there really needs to be a country targeted, individualized plan because every country has a different history, different culture, different relationship to the EU. So that needs to occur as well. That's one of the other things that need to be happening. In the UN, as a practical tip, right? Sort of, I would say that the EU needs to lower their profile. Other scholars, not only me, have said this already. Robert Kissick and others said that when, for example, Robert Kissick did research on the death penalty promotion of the EU. And he said the success of the EU was actually using the 27 member states in their networks rather than the EU as such, and to downplay the EU's extraordinary profile, right? So rather than upplaying and building it up. And also, I think with regards to the UN policies, it probably would mean to really work more on sort of, freedom of association, try to expand that, freedom of expression, right? Rather than specifically focusing in on LGBT rights per se. Because freedom of expression and freedom of assembly, for these fundamental freedoms, they are anchored in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Whereas in the UN, one of the big discussions, as you know, is to what extent are LGBT rights, included in the provisions of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Of course, they were not included initially in 1948, right? Because we didn't really talk about sexual rights, or sexual orientation and gender rights back then. So these would be just a few of the more practical ideas.
And on that note, what makes the EU LGBT promotion different from other states when we compare to the US or whatnot, or
Yeah, that's a good one. I mean, on the one hand, when you just compare it, for example, to the US, right? It seems obvious that, sort of in the US, it depends always, what kind of administration is in power, right? Republican administrations seem to be more, less focused on sexual rights and less permissive and in the promotion, whereas Democrats seem to be more keen on that. But again, democratic policies such as Hillary Clinton declaring LGBT rights are human rights, right, at the UN, that also has unintended consequences. It also has an othering effect. With regards to the EU, as a difference, the EU, I guess, because it is not a nation state that constantly has elections. Of course, there are parliamentary elections, every 5 years, but the EU can technically, one of the advantages, it has the leverage of the 27 if there is consensus, right? That makes it normatively more powerful if that is something that's desired. And B, because there are no electoral windows of 4 to 5 year windows, so much electoral pressures, you can develop more consistent positions on human rights per se than the member states, which, for example, Germany not so much, but in France next year, if Marine Le Pen should become French president, I dare to say that, right, French foreign human rights policy will look very different than under Emmanuel Macron.
So basically, it's that fragile. If it's not really tended and taken care of and maintained, one could come with one statement or whatnot. In a way, these rights taken away overnight. And we've seen it with the femonationalism that's happening across Europe and in the US. But we have a question here. If
we have
one of our presenter, one of them connects with what you talked about with Ukraine and Poland and the role that Putin plays, right? Mm-hmm. The Putin regime, as it claims to be the defender of traditional values, and how it tries to sow divisions within the EU on LGBTI issues. How successful was that, and is still going within EU's the rainbow curtain that you were talking about?
Yeah, thank you, and thanks, David. Great question. And of course, Putin's regime is a big problem. There's no doubt about it, right? And I'm often was thinking when I was writing the book, like, okay, what can be said about how can this situation be improved? And because Putin is not only suppressing LGBT voices in Russia itself, but he's also doing that exactly using EU member states. In the Balkans, which are the Balkan states, for example, Serbia, right, which is an enlargement candidate, the EU has to be very careful, and oftentimes the EU doesn't really act very much on, the suppression of media freedom there, because they know that Serbia is also ruled by Russia. Okay, and not only that, the Russia tries to infiltrate, Hungary, right, has good relations to Orban. Many far left and far right parties across Europe are similarly enamored by Putin's regime, right? And that's an achievement to be able to these both ideological extremes. But also in the UN, Russia is leading sort of one of the major anti-LGBT groups in the UN, and has basically hosted seminars on sort of religious family values, protection of children, yada yada, the usual topics, right, that they have. So this is really difficult in terms of what he does. In terms of what can be done, I mean, as you know, Putin has such a power grab. I think as long as he's in power, honestly, not much will be changing. But particularly when the Chechnya crisis came up, and the mistreatment of Chechen LGBTI individuals, I also thought that the EU could have done more, as well as the member states, to provide more refugee opportunities, right? Civil society groups have done that on their own, but if there's nothing, we cannot really externally intervene in other countries, and probably we shouldn't, then we need to make sure that people are the same with Afghanistan right now, right? We need to make sure that we provide options and opportunities for refugees that they're accepted. But even that is, if you look at the LGBT asylees in Europe, across Europe, even that is really insufficiently handled. We have 27 different countries, and basically the acceptance rate of asylum applicants across the 27 different countries are widely diverging, right? Luckily, the European Court of Justice in that case came out in 2013 saying that persecution on SOGI, on sexual orientation, gender identity grounds, is permissible across the EU. In 2014, the Court of Justice of the European Union said that asylum assessments have to be done in a human rights compliant way. So here you can see some of the positives, right? That the court really standardized, for example, human rights compliant asylum assessment rules across the European Union. How that trickles down in the implementation process on a national, regional level, that's a slightly different question.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you mentioned that even though they empower them because of their sexual orientation, whatnot, and discrimination based on their religious, their background, whatnot, happens in a way that kind of is counterproductive. And I think this is what you call the infantilizing approach. Due to colonial past, they need to teach them how to, become part of the community instead of empowering them to grow on their own. And this is what I like about you focusing on the civil society. There was one point that you highlighted that they need to be careful not to put them in the spotlight, because then within the neighboring community, because then they will be burnt by their own governments, because they are seen as supported by this West, the colonizers, whatnot. Another question.
Yeah, exactly. So visibility in itself is a ambivalent, right? It has these two sides. I mean, we have many people have a very liberal outlook on that, like, coming out, we need to come out, and you in Serbia, right, or in the Balkan countries takes gay rights, gay pride parades as a benchmark criterion that these countries are doing well. Just having a gay pride march with the same number of counter protesters, right, and no hate crime laws, no anti-discrimination procedure, does not mean that these countries are on their way of getting better. So there's I feel very ambivalent about some of these visibility measures.
Yeah, like it's a double-edged sword,
Yep, absolutely.
So another question by Tanvir: how will the future of Commonwealth Equality Network look like when they work with governments mostly who do not recognize LGBT rights?
Yeah, that's a good point. Thank you, Tanvir, for the question. Well, the Commonwealth Equality Network, right, is sort of the former colony, the British Commonwealth. They have a equality network. I don't know too much about it, but I read a little bit in Matthew Wade's work, who is focusing on a lot of Commonwealth LGBT policies. And so, I would say while the British government, as one of sort of the leaders, and again, this in itself shows you, right, a little bit of sort of the neo-colonial nature of international LGBT politics in the Commonwealth. While the British government has become much more self-reflective. I mean, going from 2009, when David Cameron literally threatened former British colony with the withdrawal of British aid if they don't adhere to Western-style LGBTI rights, to Theresa May, remember before Johnson, last prime minister, who apologized for the British. They were the ones, right, and in the 1860s, 1870s, to criminalize homosexuality in most of their former colonies. So the reason why many of the global South British colonies still criminalize homosexuality is because precisely of the British, right? So there has been a necessary recognition in the British governments, and interestingly, in the conservative British governments, right? But which has a little bit also to do with British nation branding and so on. But with regards to Brexit, Matthew Wade said that it will likely mean, that Brexit, and we see this right now happening, economic crises that are occurring on the British Isles will mean that there will be less money in the future available for things such as sponsoring the Commonwealth Equality Network budgets. Okay, so he was actually rather pessimistic about the ability of the Commonwealth to at least materially continue to support equality policies, right? Now, with regards to the governments, mostly not recognize LGBT rights. Yes, I'm just thinking here of my Jamaican case study, right, or many other African former British colonies, and it is very difficult. But in many ways, activists have made the case in those countries that homophobia is actually not indigenous. Right? Homophobia is itself a colonial import from Britain. And I think this is a smart way in which domestic activists have tried to reverse the painting and say, like, no, homophobia is not indigenous, rather it is a colonial import. And as such, we need to free us from that colonial import from homophobia. To what extent that works, that's much harder. But can you tell you that, Tanvir, cutting off aid money because benchmarks are not achieved, Western benchmarks, will certainly not contribute to the promotion of LGBT rights in adverse settings.
Yeah, for sure. Again, the change within. I have another question by Susan Swingle saying regarding how transnational movements have pushed for agenda setting, changing on the UN level, and become more inclusive of the global South. Perhaps LGBTI organizations have seen a stalemate in that area.
Right. So if I understand, thanks, Susan. If I understand correctly, she says exactly that there's, of course, also movement activities. And yes, I would definitely subscribe to it. I have not looked for my book specifically, into transnational movements per se, right? Because a lot has been written about by Ryan Thorson, on transnational LGBT rights movement, or by Phil Ayub and others. But what's also remarkable, as good as and as important the work of ILGA is in the UN, right, or of ARC International or other organizations. I mean, literally in the UN's ECOSOC, which is the Economic and Social Committee that accredits the NGOs to work with the UN, there are less than a dozen LGBTI groups accredited out of over 4,000. Okay, so that tells us something also about the reticence at which and the limited access that LGBT organizations have when trying to, implement transnational organizations work. So in that sense, the UN is still very state-centric, right? That makes, of course, that gives technically the EU much more leverage, and of course the 27 member states. But in a way, my point is maybe we need to kind of tone down again the profile of the EU and make more use of the 27 member states in their contacts, because each member state has multiple contacts, right? So hopefully if they can use that, that would achieve as much, because again, as important as the work of NGOs is at the UN, they're few and far between, and they're often kept aside. And even as individuals, I mean, I heard from trans individuals, and they said they couldn't even get into UN buildings for important meetings because they didn't have the proper, of course, gender identification passport documents. Just a little anecdote.
Exactly, and I think you connected too regarding how Western organization, because and even like local organization within the global South, because of the fundings from the EU and whatnot, they had to abide by certain standard to in a way emulate this Western push for LGBTI without being able to get creative, because the funds are kind of contingent on them pushing certain norms, and which is kind of get backlashes from the local community. We have one other questions. What are some examples of the supposed homo-colonialism? Why are nations like Poland creating hetero-inclusive zones as an attempt to thwart social progression?
Okay, great. Thanks, Anonymous. These are basically two questions, right? So I'm going to answer these two separate ones. You're welcome. The question here. The homocolonialism, right? So homocolonialism, again, is sort of a form of neo-colonialism. So colonial pressure, neo-colonialism, because the original colonialism is over, but that impresses and tries to advance homophile LGBTI politics. So it's colonialism with a LGBT-friendly face, if that makes sense, right? So examples of that homocolonialism exist basically through the insertion of human rights clauses into the development aid treaties that the EU has. Okay, and so homocolonialism manifests in that case, for example, Uganda. If I'm just taking the contentious case of Uganda, right? When Uganda in 2009 came up with the "Kill the Gays" bill that was, internationally decried, the European Parliament came up with the European Parliament resolutions and reminded Uganda, right, that it is an important trade and aid partner, and that they better adhere to the rules, otherwise they will be cut off. Again, David Cameron made the same argument, right? That, however, that pressure from outside was seen in Uganda as yet just another neo-colonial, again, intervention with an LGBT-friendly face. Together with, US evangelicals, together with the Museveni government, the domestic Museveni government that just wanted to kind of instrumentalize these external forces. They turned it around and said, like, no, you know what, we don't want that gay aid, right? We don't want to be colonized twice, as the Ghanaian president at the time said. So there are plenty of these homocolonial examples. Now, with regards to the Polish question, why are some nations like Poland creating hetero-inclusive zones? I would say homo-exclusive zones, right? They're called LGBT-friendly zones. That so far, luckily, has only happened in Poland. But, well, there are a couple of things that need to be noted, right? First of all, after the imposition of these zones were created in large part based on an artificial culture war that the current Polish government right now is pulling up to detract from other issues, such as, for example, the rule of law, which is a case that's pending with the European Union right now, right? And this is my point, rather than just focusing on the LGBT-free zones, which need to be addressed in certain manners, what really is critical is to address Poland's rule of law issues, right? Those need to be tackled, because that means there are no independent courts anymore in Poland. And for example, in that case, the Polish court itself, when it was still independent, declared those LGBT-free zones in Poland as unconstitutional, not in line with the Polish constitution. So here you see how important independent courts are, right? And that's why the EU needs to insist on the independence of the Polish legal system. I think that's pretty much it right now for the Polish question. There was, I can say more about it. Another thing about the Polish cases, right? Poland a year ago had the largest demonstration in its history, and they were after the Texas-style imposition of abortion limits. Yet, over the last year, we have hardly heard about these and the negative impact those had. I mean, hundreds of women, thousands of women had to move abroad to other countries. Recently, a Polish woman died, right, because the doctors didn't want to do the emergency abortion. So in that sense, you can see here, that was hardly mentioned, but there was too much visibility focused on LGBTI individuals that also securitize these people.
Yeah, again, fascinating work regarding how you highlight the inner works and how it pushes different insecurities regarding different groups because of, political interest. So you talk about, the issue of negotiating power and the incoherencies across your book regarding development policies, inner politics, and foreign trade and whatnot. When it comes to the EU, you also mentioned that it's declining in its role as this giant norm diffuser of human rights and whatnot, and it's more looking inward. Can you elaborate a bit more on what is the future regarding neighborhood policies, all these issues that come with it? I don't
Yeah.
know, especially because of the immigration with Brexit and all these stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think the neighborhood policy that didn't really aid LGBT rights over the last 15 years, right? Nor did it aid, by the way, and I make the case in my book, I look at the democracy indicators over time, and similarly, democracy didn't improve really from Morocco all the way to Ukraine, right? For a number of reasons that are often country specific, or because the EU preferred stability of those countries over, sort of instability, right? And therefore, they often supported the autocrats and authoritarians in those countries rather than, allowing for more democratic civic resistance. It's another, hypocritical issue. But really, the neighborhood policy has not been effective, so much so that the EU themselves, in a review in 2015, said it's not working, which is why the neighborhood policy has now been in Brussels style included in the mega ministry, sort of, for neighborhood, international cooperation, and development. That's led by a very capable Scandinavian commissioner. So I do have a little bit hope. And the EU also committed now that all future external policies, 85% of those need to have a positive impact on gender equality.
Yeah.
Okay, which is generally great, but two things. Eight is, what is gender equality, right? Whereas the EU includes transgender, for example, under gender equality, global South countries always, very often, make the case that they want gender equality as related to women only. So here we can see again a sort of a conceptual and normative disparity between the EU and its external partners. And another one, just to show you a little anecdote, is we also receive here EU grants, and I was in a training, a foreign policy instrument training by the EU, and we had an argument with the EU, me and other directors, with the EU trainers, because the EU trainers asked us to collect binary gender data. Basically, when we have attendees for events, are you male or female? And we said, why are you doing? You can't do this, right? This is not okay. And then literally the answer that we got is because we have to prove to Brussels, to the EU, that we're doing something for gender equality, for women equality, right? So what you see here again, in the attempt to technically do something good, inadvertently the EU actually limits some of these gender equality rights.
Yeah, it's like it becomes this lip service, an addition, right? Addition to the actual agenda. So here's what we're gonna do. And by the way, we're gonna include that.
Exactly. So yeah, and so basically at the end of the book, I come out saying, yeah, you know what, the EU tries well. It has had some achievements, but there are these very shortcomings, lack of intersectionality, hyper visible and hyper normative promotion. Disparities that are unintended consequences and disparities. But I think it's also important to realize that we need to maybe just step back and admit that the universality of human rights is not as universal as it can be, right? Even critical theorists, even Judith Butler, even Slavoj Žižek, and others have said that, universal of human rights doesn't exist and they're contingent upon the national conditions. And if the EU is unable to really individualize their approach to other countries in a sufficient manner, then I think they need to step back from what others have called that human right maximalism, right? Trying to achieve everything, and rather do, work more on trying to prevent the worst human rights abuses, trying to work on basic civil rights. Even though, again, once we get into the democracy promotion area, that in itself is also problematic, right? And contested.
So that's why, like you say, also they need to streamline their inner, issues within their, the member states before streamline of common, coherent foreign policy agenda.
Absolutely, and the instruments are there. The political was not there, but the European Court of Human Rights, for example, its legislation is binding among all member states, right? And so there has been a push to try to kind of make a more stronger legal push for LGBT rights across. Now, last year, the EU came up with a roadmap for LGBTI rights, but the roadmap is voluntary. And the roadmap was only asked by 19 mostly Western states. The Central Eastern European countries didn't ask for it, don't really want it anyway, right? So that disparity that you mentioned, I mean, that exists, and as long as it continues to exist so starkly, more of a visible normative push internally or externally will not remedy the problem. Let's just say it that way.
And also it was used as a justification for the right wings to say, oh, you see, you West are forcing us, right, to become more like you. What about our religious freedom? What about all the,
Absolutely, and part of it will take time. Transformation, of societies and cultures. That topic really came only on the EU's, platform about 20-25 years ago. It takes time, and if you look at larger indicators, there have been improvements over time, right? Just the improvements are not as quick as some political stakeholders want them to. And so, we need to make sure exactly kind of like be a little bit more realistic about that as well.
You said like there were almost 7% increase of positive attitude towards the LGBT rights. So on that note, I would like to thank you so much for this.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the audience.
And I would like to thank all the people that attended this event. Again, I tried to put somewhere there the link for the book, for where you can check it out and hopefully can purchase. And it's a trailblazing book. I really think it's gonna gain a lot of attention because it brings out all this, great information regarding, very important topic that we're seeing today. Thank you so much.
Really appreciate it. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Jessy. Thank you. Take care.
Bye, everyone.